Inside the halls of San Diego State University lies a program dedicated to storytelling and pursuing the truth. Welcome to Where You At, a podcast that takes you inside the work of alumni for the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State. Our goal is to show the success of our alumni, inspire students with the stories, and connect students and alums on a pathway to journalism success. And now, here's your host, Josh Suchon.
This week on the Where You At podcast, we are stepping into the octagon for some hard-hitting questions about what it's like being a journalist who covers mixed martial arts. Our guest is Simon Samano. He attended San Diego State from 2000 through 2005. He initially worked in the newspaper business, North County Times, Bay Area News Group, also Bakersfield, Californian. Then he had about 3 years at NFL.com, about 5 years with the USA Today Sports Group. And now for quite a while, he's been working for MMAJunkie.com. He is the managing editor. Hopefully neither one of us will tap out of this podcast. Simon, welcome to the Where You At podcast.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me, man. Thanks for the MMA-themed intro there. Way to stick it.
Looking forward to talking to Simon. Simon and I have been able to hang out a couple of times through mutual friends, and so I know a little bit about him, and I always feel like there's a kinship amongst people who worked at the Daily Aztec, but I'm excited to find out more details about Simon and how he got to where he is right now. And I always like to start off just immediately, like what you're doing now. Give us, I feel like this could be a two-part question, but you can answer it any way you want. What's a normal week entail? Maybe when there is a fight coming up on the weekend, maybe when there's not a fight coming up on the weekend. Like, what's a normal week like in your job with MMAJunkie.com?
When is there not a fight coming up on the weekend? There's fights coming up on the weekend all the time. I mean, in our MMA media industry, we've got anywhere from like 40 to 45 UFC events a year that we cover. And being that we are a hardcore MMA website catered towards the passionate MMA audience and passionate MMA fan base, we're covering all of them. Not a lot of weekends without fights, man. I mean, but yeah, there's a lot of, it's both like, it makes it difficult because you want to give a little bit more to some of these fights and fighters, but like you're already moving on to the next week's fights a lot of times right after the, current weekend has just happened. So it's just kind of like, well, wash, rinse, repeat. I'm not going to lie. It's a little bit like a wash, rinse, repeat. We try to sneak in some bigger features and some bigger stuff when the events rise to the level, because not all of these events that we cover are filled with the greatest fights. But like I said, being that I am the managing editor for MMA Junkie and we are catered to that audience, that's what it is. It's really just me working with my staff. I have a staff of 12 that I manage, about a handful of reporters. I got a few video editors. I got a couple of guys who host the MMA Junkie Radio podcast. They've been doing it for a long time. Shout out to George and Goes. All those guys. I mean, it's really just, it's a lot of planning, but I also feel like I have a really great staff that knows what they're doing. And it's a lot of just checking in. There isn't really a lot of like me having to micromanage, so to speak. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I've been doing this for the last, with MMA Junkie for the last 7 years. I do still work for USA Today because it's part of USA Today Network. So I've been with USA Today for like 12 years, 13 years now, but it's a grind. If I was going to sum up everything I just said, it's a grind, man.
When I think about my time working for a newspaper and I think about the best editors, a lot of times for me, it was just someone who's a sounding board, someone where I'm like, hey, I think I got this idea, and maybe they'll say, well, talk to this person, talk to that person, or I don't know if our audience really cares about that too much, or, oh yeah, I think the audience really cares a lot about that. So yeah, we all need editors to fix our mistakes, our grammar, to make sure the commas are where they're supposed to be. But I'm curious your thoughts on just being the best managing editor to help bring the best out of your writers and your staff and what that means.
I feel like it's more collaboration than anything. I'm just trying to collaborate with my staff a lot, If there are things that I want done a certain way, sure, like, the boss, mentality will come in. But for the most part, I'm trying to collaborate. I am working with them on, little things like their writing, but also, you may review some interviews here and there. But for the most part, it's a collaboration with my staff. Like I said, I've got a team of pros that have been doing this for a good while, and they know what they're doing. Like they really do know what they're doing. And it's really just a matter of me fine tuning certain things and certain aspects of their work. And there's a lot of it. I mean, a lot of MMA happening. So there's a lot of things, shout out to my entire staff, because they really do. They work hard to cover this sport inside and out.
Is mixed martial arts something that you grew up watching? Was it something that you always wanted to work in this sport? Was it a dream, or did this kind of stumble into your world?
Answering the first part of that, I have always enjoyed mixed martial arts, probably since about 2008. It's probably when I became really into it. I got really curious into it through Tito Ortiz, the Tito Ortiz era in the early 2000s. But that was, Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, like those guys piqued my interest. But I didn't really get into it until George St. Pierre came around. George St. Pierre absolutely captured my imagination, I was like, I was astounded with him, and I was a big fan of his when I first started really focusing on MMA. It was because of George St. Pierre. So I followed the sport for a good 16, 17 years pretty closely. Obviously now in these last 7 years, it's been very closely, it's a normal thing. As far as getting involved with MMA Junkie, I did stumble into this in some way. I was with, as you mentioned, I was with USA Today Sports, and I was on like the general sports digital desk. And I was a senior digital producer that was managing a small group of like a West Coast team. I had like 3 or 4 people that reported to me. And it was mostly evening shifts. And we were mostly doing things like running the sports front, writing headlines on the sports front, placing stories and programming where they had to go, writing short stuff that we had to do because by the evening, West Coast time, late East Coast time, you don't have a whole lot of, writers or reporters that are around. So anything that would happen late with a baseball game or late with an NBA game, right? Like we're the ones responsible for getting those posts up, right? So I was doing that for a good, I guess it must have been 4 or 5 years. The person who was running USA Today Sports Media Group at the time, Chris Perrone, we worked in the same office. But even though I was part of USA Today Sports, I was part of USA Today proper, and he was running Sports Media Group, which is kind of like its own division within USA Today. And he sort of asked me if I would be interested in moving over. I think he noticed some of the work that I did and the ideas that I had and how I was digital savvy. And he asked if I was interested, and he knew I liked MMA. So, kind of asked if I would be interested in moving over. I knew this job, whereas what I was doing was more programming and like headline writing and that kind of thing. I knew working for MMA Junkie would give me an opportunity to sort of flex more of my creativity, my ideas, and give me a little bit more ownership of something. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I stumbled into this job, so to speak, with MMA Junkie. And I'm grateful to Chris for that, that he recognized that.
Let's rewind now. Let's go back to you're finishing high school and you decide to go to college. Why San Diego State and why journalism?
San Diego State was because of the few family vacations that we took them to San Diego. I had an aunt who was in the Navy, and she lived in Vista at the time. And whenever we wanted to go on a family trip, which was maybe about 3 or 4 times growing up, like we didn't go on a lot of family vacations. We would always go visit her, which would become, going to San Diego, doing touristy San Diego stuff like the zoo and, SeaWorld and Old Town and all that stuff. And the more I spent time in San Diego, the more I loved it. We would go in the summers. So I loved the weather, and I was just drawn to San Diego pretty instantly. This would have been from the time I was like 12 until I was about 15. Maybe we went 3 times to San Diego, and I knew like, that's where I want to be. That's where I want to go to school. I knew I didn't want to stay in a small town, and I knew I wanted to be in a big city. And so when I discovered San Diego through those trips, I just knew that's where I wanted to be. And I, to the point where when I was even willing to go to San Marcos, to go to Cal State San Marcos, just so I could be close to San Diego. Like I applied to Cal State San Marcos and I got in. I would have gone there if San Diego State hadn't taken me. So, journalism is because I got into journalism because this would date back to high school. My junior year of high school, I just realized that I enjoyed writing and I was a good writer. And my English teacher at the time, Miss Fowler, she really encouraged me to pursue writing. I didn't know in what fashion, at the time. I was like, well, am I going to be an author? Am I going to write books? I don't think that's what I want to do. But as I got older into my senior year, you start developing your thoughts in the world, and I started paying attention to things like politically and stuff like that. And originally I was like, I'm going to be a journalist and I'm going to be a political reporter. That's exactly what I wanted to do when I was 17 years old. I knew I wanted to be a political reporter, but that changed. I knew I wanted to do that even in my first couple of years at San Diego State, but it changed.
Explain why it changed and how it changed.
When I was at the Daily Aztec, I got my start at the Daily Aztec in the opinion section. So I was writing opinion columns. This wasn't my freshman year. I didn't start doing it immediately. But the opinion section was my introduction into writing for the Daily Aztec. And that was because at that point, I was definitely very much, in a political state of mind, very conscious of what's happening in the world, locally, nationally. Like, I was that guy at like protests and stuff like that. Like that was me, I was very passionate about those things. And after the first year that I wrote opinion columns, the job opened up to be the assistant opinion editor. And I really wanted that. And I applied for it, but I didn't get it. And that bummed me out because I thought I deserved it. Not gonna lie. I thought I deserved it. I thought I had written some really strong columns for us all year. And I know that there was a strong response to the things that I would write. And I really wanted to run that. I really wanted to run the opinion section. I wanted to get to that point. So when that happened, I pivoted to sports and I was doing both. I figured, well, why not do both? And this was during the time when Mike Klitzing was the sports editor. So I worked for him. Shout out to Mike, because he was a really great editor to work for. And he really helped me a lot in terms of just how to craft game stories and features and all that stuff. Like that was real world experience that paid huge dividends. And so once I realized that I loved that and I had never really given any thought to doing sports journalism, that's when I went all in on sports journalism. And so that's how I ended up covering sports.
You mentioned earlier coming from a small town. What did it mean to your family, to your entire family, that you went away to college? What did that mean?
It meant a lot. I mean, I was the first. I was the first in my family to go to college. It meant a lot. My parents raised me right. I was the oldest. I'm the oldest of four. I have three younger sisters. I knew that I wanted to move out of my small town. I grew up in Gonzales, California, on the Central Coast, small farming town of about 6,000, mostly, predominantly Hispanic, a lot of farmers, a lot of migrants. Like that's where I grew up. I just grew up in a small town, and I knew that I wanted some action. And so I knew I wanted to go to San Diego and San Diego State. I knew I wanted to get out. I knew college was my way out of like the area where I lived. It was the way that I would be able to pursue something. College was the way to do it. So grades were always a thing, for me, to make sure I was on top of my grades. For some reason, I just understood that. I just understood the importance of good grades. Certainly helped that my dad rode my ass all throughout, but he definitely rode me and was on me a lot with my grades and didn't let me stumble. And so, yeah, like just getting good grades, doing good in sports, those were all things that I really owe to my parents. It meant a lot. Like, I just remember when I graduated from San Diego State, how much it meant to me that my Nana and my Tata were there. My grandma Carrie was there, like that meant the world to me. And they were always by my side. I had a great support system, like growing up, from my grandparents and, like friends of my dad's, like my Kenny, my godfather. They would come to like football games, wrestling matches and stuff like that. And they were always supportive. Without that, like, I don't know that I could, I would be where I'm at right now.
Let's talk some more about the support staff that you find when you're at San Diego State, whether that's professors. You mentioned Mike Klitzing earlier, who was the sports editor at the Daily Aztec. Other classes, other individuals, finding that support staff, how they helped you, and then how you helped others once you started to gain this knowledge.
I really do have to go back to shouting out Mike a little more, because like Mike, I thought the world of Mike Klitzing when I started working for the Daily Aztec. I really did. I thought he was a freaking great writer, man. Like, to the point where I was like, oh, I want to aspire to write like the way Mike does, the way he puts these thoughts and these things together. Like, that was really motivating, as far as like other classes and stuff like that, I mean, have a lot of people brought up Professor Spivak on this
Oh
podcast?
yes. Oh yes.
I mean, a million times, right?
Right?
Like,
Yes. How do you not
come
bring
on,
up
dude.
Professor Spivak if he was one of your professors?
Dude, oh my gosh. Like if Professor Spivak taught you journalism, the one thing you would take away from that class was attention to detail, accuracy, beholden to the truth. That class, the classes that I took with Spivak, which I believe was two of them, it might have just been one, but I thought it was two. I think it was two. Those classes, dude, those were the ones that were teaching me that teach you the technical aspect of journalism, and what it means, like to be detail oriented, like you have to be in this industry, in this profession. So always a shout out to Professor Spivak, also to Professor Feldman. His class was like the year after Spivak's class. I don't know. Has anybody brought up Professor Feldman before?
Yeah. He gets a bunch of love too.
He likes to call himself the Great Feldini. Has that ever come up on this podcast? His class as well. Like those two classes alone were like crash courses on journalism and how to deal with important issues. How to make sure that you're adhering to the truth, accuracy, grammar, spelling, do all these things that we take for that really are like taken for granted now. Like those are the things that those classes were everything. Like those two classes alone. Shout out to both Professor Spivak and Feldman.
Whenever I think about Professor Spivak, so for those who don't know him who are listening to this, you could not write the second sentence of your story until the first sentence was perfect. So you wrote the first sentence, you printed it out. Once he approved it, and usually it took multiple takes, and then you could write the second sentence. But then there would also be certain things that he intentionally forced you to come up to him and ask him questions. And he would have like these note cards that would be written down, and based on the question, he would show you the note cards so that you then had more information. And I remember one time I went up to him and I said, "Can you tell me?" And then whatever the question was. And he said, "Yes." And I just kept waiting, like, okay, well then tell me. And then he just looked at me and I was like, can you tell me? And he's like, "Yes, I can tell you." And so what he was teaching me to do was not ask, "Can you tell me? Will you tell me?" It's ask the question. What happened to this? Ask a very specific question to get a very specific answer instead of this generic, "Can you tell me?" And so and it just came back to me. You mentioning Professor Spivak, it just came back to me that attention to detail is not just what you write, but it's also attention to detail with the questions that you ask people.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, that sounds like a classic Spivak, a classic Spivak experience right there. And that's what that was like. He was always trying to extract from you like everything he could. He only gave A's or F's. Like if you did something, I feel like he only gave A's or F's. Or there was instances where it was an A or an F. You either did it right or you did it wrong. If you did it wrong, you had to figure out why you did it wrong, and you had to ask those questions. And that was all part of the training, because asking questions is such a big deal in what we do. It's everything, right? You have to ask the right questions. You have to know how to ask the right questions. It's not just asking the right question. You can ask the right question, but did you phrase it the right way so that you could get the answer, that you really are looking for from somebody? Man, those classes were everything.
I think a really important part of sports journalism, which I try to tell current students all the time, is you probably got into this because at some level you were a fan, because you care about sports, because this athlete, this team inspired you, that makes you care. But then there's a certain point where it has to stop, where there's the obvious rule, there's no cheering in the press box, but it also becomes, you can still maybe be a fan over here, but when you're there writing, when you're there covering an event, you are there as an objective reporter. And I'm wondering if you can speak to what that process was like for you, whether it clicked one day, or what that evolution was like for you to say, "I can't be a fan today. I have a job to do as an objective reporter."
Well, that I mean, you can attest to this. That's especially a difficult thing when you're still in school working for a school newspaper and you want to root for for your school at that time, but you're in the press box. Can't do that. For whatever reason, I can't really explain it. Like, I just understood that quickly. Like, I just understood right away. It's not what you do. I would sit in the press box. This would have been around covering San Diego State football, for instance, or basketball, like 2004, 2005. And I would have guys like Kevin Acey and Ed Graney and Mike Sullivan from the North County Times, who I essentially eventually worked with, and you just see that what their demeanor was in the press box. I was always observant in the press box, always. Like if a play happened during a game and they were writing something down and I wasn't, I was like, why am I not taking a note right now? What are they writing? Because whatever it is that they saw, it's going to end up in your story later. So anyways, I got a little bit of sidetracked there, but like I'm just remembering my experience in the press box with those guys, because those guys, like seeing those guys was a huge deal, like just observing them. But for whatever reason, that just clicked. Like there's no cheering in the press box. It's not something you do. You got to be objective. Objectivity clicked with me pretty quickly. It wasn't really an evolution. I think I just got it right away. I think I just understood, like, you had to be professional. You weren't going to be high-fiving anybody in the locker room afterward. You were there to do a job. I was there to ask questions, and that was it. Like, it's just something you can't teach that. You just have to understand, like, that's just the way it works. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of your sports fandom. Your sports fandom doesn't have to go away. You have to know when to be professional.
Those years, Simon was at SDSU 2000 through 2005. I know 2005, the team made the tournament in basketball, but those are some lean years for the football team. And I'm curious, first time you write something and it's negative, and a player, a coach, administration, maybe not very happy with you, and basically how you come to grips with the fact that this is my job to write something negative, even if it is my school and even if there's some people who may not like it.
Who was the linebacker on the football team? Matt McCoy, was that his name?
That sounds.
He was alongside Kirk Morrison. I think there was an instance where I wrote something negative about him, and he didn't want to talk to me. Like the next time I tried to ask him a question at practice, and it was for something that I can't remember. But that was a wake up call, because it was the first time that I had experienced it, and it makes you, like, it's a little bit of a gut punch when that happens for the first time. And it really is. But I also understood that, like, you got to be objective. And so when you do well, you write or say things in a positive way. When you don't perform well on the field or on the court, you write, say things, it's going to be critical. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's just like, to me, that just comes to like it now. I deal with now in MMA. It's really difficult to deal with that, because so many MMA fighters really expect the coverage to sort of act as promotion in a sense. And it's difficult to wade through that. So if you say something negative about a fighter now, they get really sensitive. Like, fighters are really tough people, but they get sensitive when you write something negative or say something negative about them, man. Where it's like, manager will threaten to not even give you access or interview, and stuff like that. Like, we've dealt with that at MMA Junkie. I don't know. It's just people. You just gotta know how to deal with people at the end of the day.
As long as journalism has existed, there's been people who've said that journalism is dying, that it's hard to get jobs. They said that to me when I was a student in the 90s. You probably heard it when you were a student in the early 2000s. We hear it now all the time. We don't have to go into all of the details about the different jobs that you took along the path to where you are. But when you reflect on initially coming out of college, making the transition to making this your career, what were some of the most important decisions that you had to make, that the different things that you did in order to get this job that led to this job, that led to that job?
Yeah, the biggest decision that I had to make would have been when I left the North County Times to move to Vallejo. I had been at the North County Times since before I graduated in 2005, grinding my teeth covering preps, high school football, the high school sports. And I was only part-time though. I was only part-time, and I had spent like 2.5 years there. And then opportunity opened up at the Vallejo Times Herald for a full-time job, that would pay me a little bit more, a little bit more. It wasn't going to pay me a lot, but it's going to pay me a little bit more. It was going to allow me to really work on designing the newspaper as well as writing. Like, it was going to be a do-it-all thing. And I knew that was the experience that I needed. But that was tough because I did not want to move out. I did not want to leave San Diego. Like, I did not want to leave San Diego. I was sad, but I knew it's what I had to do for my career. And that was a big deal because it sort of started like a chain of events, like going to Vallejo. I only spent 1 year in Vallejo, and the Bakersfield Californian came after a year. But here's the thing about that. I had applied for a job with the Bakersfield Californian only after about 4 to 6 months that I was in Vallejo, and I didn't get it. I was one of the 2 finalists for a full-time preps writer, only writing. I wasn't going to have to design the newspaper. It's exactly what I wanted. Exactly what I wanted was to be just focus on writing good stories in the community, and I didn't get it. And Tony LaCava, who's the editor at the Bakersfield Californian, had a lot of nice things to say to me when he let me down gently. But he did tell me, Simon, if I have an opportunity, another opening, like I will circle back to you. Just keep doing what you're doing, stay in touch, et cetera, et cetera. Tony kept his word, dude. Like 4 months later, he reached back out to me when they had another opening. And that's the job that I got. So I ended up spending a full year. That was really critical. But yeah, I mean, honestly, some of the toughest stuff for me in my career came through no choice of my own, because I spent 3 months in Bakersfield and I got laid off. So, what are you going to do? Right.
Yeah.
Like, it is what it is, that was obviously difficult.
You haven't been a real journalist until you've been laid off.
It's happened to me twice. Happened to me twice, man. And, you just got to pick yourself up. That was tough.
When you work for NFL.com, okay, now we're talking about the biggest sport in this country. We're talking about this behemoth where there is so much that is out there. There's so many eyeballs, but it's also hard to get in with them, and it's hard to kind of separate yourself. Describe some of your most memorable experiences working for NFL.com that others can learn from.
I had to sort of like grapple with the fact that I at this point, when I took the NFL job, and when I got that job, which I definitely like pursued heavily because I had moved to Culver City, and I knew that the NFL offices were here in Culver City at the time. So I pursued trying to get a job there. I targeted it. Took me 10 months, but it finally happened. That was the one thing that I had to grapple with. Was I wasn't working for like an independent media outlet. Now I was working for the NFL. Mm-hmm. I did initially feel like I was selling out. I'm not gonna lie. Like I was working for the league sponsored website, And this would have been back in 2009. Now things have changed in the last 15 years since I first started with them, because at that time, NFL.com was sort of acting as a sort of extension of a PR arm, It was different. Now it's acting as its own independent media outlet, to the point where you'd even have instances where, like, there's people who work for the NFL or on NFL airwaves criticizing the NFL, right? Like they criticized Roger Goodell on NFL Network. That was like a no-no when I first started. So I had to grapple with that. That was the thing. But yeah, I mean, there at NFL though, like if I was going to shout someone out from there, it would be Justin Hathaway. Justin Hathaway was the news editor. He was my boss for like 2 years that I worked there. And that's a guy who brought me back to that's a guy who brought me back after being away from the game for so long. Cause I was laid off for 10 months and I was without working in the industry for 10 months. He got me passionate again about like the journalism aspect of our job. He was a great news editor, and I'm still in contact with Justin. He's a great guy.
If you don't mind me asking, during the 10 months, how much do you think about, well, it was a good run in journalism. Maybe it's time to do something else. Maybe it's, maybe there's a job that's got normal hours where I'm not going to work nights and weekends and holidays, and kind of go through your, the different things that go through your mind in terms of deciding, how much do I still have a fire for wanting to do this? Do I go back to politics? Do I try to get into politics? And kind of how you think through the different opportunities as you try to pursue these.
I never wavered on the fact that I wanted to get back into sports. That was my passion at that point. And the reason why I had, at that time that I got laid off, my wife and I, we weren't married at the time, but like she was my girlfriend. We had been together for about a year. She was really patient with me, like really patient, like was very supportive. And I don't know if she wasn't that supportive, that I would have, like, without that, knowing that, I never really felt a lot of pressure. So, I did do some like freelance work for, MLS, covering soccer. I supplanted my income playing poker, like, and I was just working it, like checking job message boards on a regular basis. I rode my bike one day to NFL Network to try and get in to speak with somebody there, just to let them know that I was in town. Like, if you ever have a job, I'm your guy. I'm here. Like, I did that. I got stiff armed at the front desk. The front desk girl wouldn't let me. She wouldn't let me speak to who would be my eventual boss. Which is funny because my eventual boss, who was Jim Loftus, I had told him afterwards that I had done that, and he was like, "Oh, she should have just let you through. She was being a little, had her security hat on. She should have let you through." I was like, "Yeah, she should have let me through. I could have got this job 6-7 months earlier." Honestly, just to circle it back though, like without this, my wife was she was really patient with me at a time when she really didn't have to be. We were very early in our relationship. So she could have been like, "Oh, this dude doesn't have a job. Like, what am I doing with this guy?" But she was very patient with me. And without that patience and that support, I wouldn't have been able to have gotten the NFL job. And that really took me to the next level of my career, because from NFL, it was USA Today, and now I am where I am.
We're going to continue on with that, but I want to share a quick anecdote. When I got laid off, there was a place that I would go to on Mondays for pub trivia with my friends. And I found out that the host was leaving and that they needed someone to be the host of pub trivia. And so I thought, well, I'm already going here most Mondays anyways, and now I can be the host, and they would pay me $50. And then I learned that if I wrote the questions, I'd get paid another $50 and I would get a free meal. And so I thought, all right, well, now that's $100 a week. That's an extra $400 that I didn't have yesterday. And I'm getting 4 free meals. And so as I was trying to figure out, like, how am I going to get my next job? How am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to do these different things? And I just thought, all right, well, this is great. Instead of spending money going to pub trivia, now I'm making money going to pub trivia. And it's just what you do in order to find a way to just, and I look back on that now, and all of the public speaking that I'd done as a broadcaster, no one's looking at me, right? When you're doing play-by-play, no one sees you, they hear you. But when you're in front of a crowd and you're saying questions and then you're giving the answer and people are upset and sometimes they're booing you because they don't like the question, or their handwriting wasn't correct as you're like trying to fill it out. And like you realize that you're working the room, and it was a different level of public speaking that I'd never done. And I actually thought that helped me tremendously with some of the other things that I've done with my career now.
That's awesome. I mean, I can't really say I had that sort of layoff experience. I mean, I was playing poker, doing some freelancing for MLS, and wedding catering.
Wedding catering.
Yep. That's what I was doing for about 10 months before I got the NFL job.
All right, let's talk about a little bit more about MMA Junkie. And I want to ask you about a story that you did October 20th, 2020 is when it was published. And this was a story about Danielle Nickerson. She is the ex-wife of Mike Perry, an MMA fighter. And when I read this story, my heart was racing. It was terrifying about domestic abuse, what Mike did to her. I want to get into some more details about kind of the story behind the story. First, and I understand that you may not be able to tell everything. You have to protect your sources and things like that. But first, how do you become aware of this story, and where do you begin in trying to tell this horrific story?
Became aware of the story because Danielle Nickerson, she had posted something on Instagram, and it was cryptic, and it was alluding to domestic violence. And she had tagged quite a few MMA media outlets. Plus, she tagged Ariel Helwani. She tagged Joe Rogan. And I'm thinking, no one's going to take this story. But it piqued my interest. And I kind of knew, we knew Mike Perry's history of behaviors kind of documented. So it didn't seem like this was just a woman who was, fishing for attention, or, people say that all the time. So I looked into it. I just messaged her. I responded to her directly. We had a conversation that was off the record at the time, just so I could figure out what I was dealing with here. And in that initial conversation is when I found out she had told me she had done this, in terms of like she called there was a 911 call. She mentioned how she had filed a restraining order. She mentioned all these things that she had done. And I was like, well, if I'm going to tell this story, like I'm going to have to access those things. Like I have to find this documentation. I can't just write a story taking your word, it's going to make you look unbelievable. It's not enough for me to go on, but let me dig around and find, where all these things are. Once I found all that stuff and, I had a hold of those things, it supported her account, it supported her account to where it was strong enough to go with. Now, there was a lot of things that I had to work with, like that I had to sort of maneuver. And I brought in, this is the great thing about working for like a big company like USA Today. Like I leaned on a USA Today editor, for guidance on this to some degree. Like, hey, what do we think of this? Is this good enough? Because this was editor, his name's Pete Barzilai. He works in investigations, not necessarily, that's not my specialty, but he was an investigations editor. And so I would lean on him about where we stand, how I write this, how I write that. He was awesome to work with. And we got to the point where, like we have her word. We have all these documented instances of things through police reports, 911 calls. Story was a go. Like story was a go. She shared pictures with me that she didn't want published from, instances that had happened. She just didn't want to have them published because she didn't want to be ridiculed. Of course, like the internet is an awful place. That still happened, but she did not want to have photos of her that she took of herself after these instances floating around. So once everything was lined up, it was all systems go. And I wanted to make sure that her story got told the right way.
When it comes to contacting the different, whether it's manager for the MMA fighter or whether it's the head, what's your strategy, for lack of a better word, for this is the story that we have, this is the information that we have, this is when we're planning on running it, you have X amount of time to give us your response to it?
That's exactly what it was. I mean, the story was ready to go. And I knew that we were published ready, except for the comment. Like I had worked on the story for so long.
How long? 2 weeks?
Yeah, about a month. Yeah. About a month. Yeah. Just making sure that everything was airtight. I had to make sure everything was airtight in terms of all the documentation of the allegations and all that stuff. Then I interviewed her. I did an extensive interview with her. She wanted to go on camera. She agreed to go on camera because she wanted to be able to also tell her story. Like I told her, like, I'm going to have a written component because I have to be able to let them know. But you want to tell your story, we'll do an interview and we'll go that route as well. Absolutely. Like you be able to tell your own story too.
Did you do it in person, over the phone, over Zoom? This is still, the pandemic
COVID.
Year.
Yeah, this is still height of COVID. So yeah. It was over Zoom. It was remote. But as far as your question though about reaching out, we were published ready. Yeah, like then you have to make that hard phone call. You have to make that hard phone call to the manager of the fighter. Like, hey, just so you know, I've got this, and this. Like, this is the story that we're running. I've got the documentation. I've got the 911 call. I've got the restraining order. I've got all this. She showed me pictures. Like, I want to give you an opportunity here to give me comment. And that conversation went predictably how I thought it would go. With the manager trying to talk me out of running it, just going off her word and this and that, everything and whatever, everything you would think of. We're not going to let your MMA junkie is not going to. We're not going to let you talk to our fighters because he's managing a team of fighters. All that stuff. It's like that's not going to dissuade me from running this. And that's not going to dissuade me from running this story. Tough conversation, but you just handle it like a pro, man.
Yeah.
Like my emotions on that phone call and a phone call like that, my emotions just check out the window. No emotions making that call. It's just business. Like, hey man, I've done my work. I've done my due diligence. This is your opportunity to provide a comment. What ended up happening was they provided no comment, but then like 3 hours later posted their own thing on Twitter, which really just ramped up interest in my story that was dropping the next morning.
Yeah.
So, thanks for, they revved it up a little bit more. People were curious that evening and overnight, like what it was. and who, because they had teased an MMA media outlet. They didn't say it was going to be MMA Junkie. So that night on social media, people are asking, I wonder who it's going to be. That's right in the story, this, that, and the other, revved up, piqued a bunch of curiosity. And then sure enough, like we drop it on the next morning, and there was a lot of interest in that story. Can't say it was all positive, because the MMA fan base can be vile and awful, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And I want to follow up, if you don't mind, on one more about that, in that you mentioned the MMA fan base. They're there to watch fights, right? They love fights. And, there's a very technical part of MMA. There's also a big part of you're trying to knock somebody out. And what we know now about CTE, concussions, and things like that. And when your primary audience is people that may not want to hear these stories, right? They kind of want to put their head in the sand and just watch a fight. But you start to realize the long-term impact that happens from these fighters. And I'm wondering, for you and your staff and USA Today Sports Group in general, I feel like in some ways you could write a story almost every single day about this, but just how you balance, this is a really important story, and the audience may not always want to hear this story.
Yeah, the MMA audience never wants to hear that story. I mean, very few of them do. Those types of stories, very few of them want to hear about anything other than fight hype, and the next fight. The fan base is just, it's a tough, like that's the hardest part of my job. The hardest part of my job is just the fact that the audience that I'm serving can just be very cruel and vile. And I know that's weird, because that might be a weird thing to hear, because like I enjoy fights. Like I have to reconcile the fact that, and MMA fans have to reconcile the fact that, like, you enjoy violence. It happens in a cage, sanctioned, you enjoy it. We see other instances of violence happen. We deride those things. We're appalled at instances of violence that we see in other settings, right? But MMA fans, and even myself, who was, I'm a fan, but I mean, I'm trying to cover the sport the right way. That's a hard thing to reconcile. And so, yeah, dude, like, I don't know. It's the audience just never, the audience never seems to care about anything other than fight hype. And, like with regard to the Nickerson story, the comments were they're just vile, man. Just the worst stuff that you can think of, and that's what was so difficult. We actually made a decision like 3 years ago, finally, thank God, to turn comments off on our website. Going through those comments took a mental toll. Like it really took a mental toll. It was not good for my mental health to spend part of my day on a regular basis going through the comments of MMA stories. Awful, dude. Just wore me down. And so when we made the decision, which was a decision not just by me, like I pushed for it, but I needed somebody above to sign off on, us doing away with comments. It was just a huge weight off my shoulders, man. This was only about 2-3 years ago too. So for about a good 4 years, I'm like on a daily basis going through comment sections that just have the most vile, derogatory, bigotry, like just awful, dude. I hated it. I hated that part of my job so much. It's been a lot better since we got rid of those.
I appreciate how candid you are in discussing this. And I think it's an important thing, whether it's students or anyone who's not in journalism, to understand the mental toll it can take and, decisions that get made. And I'm really glad to hear that you guys no longer put comments on there. So thank you for your candidness in that and everything else. We're going to start to wrap things up here on the podcast for this week, Simon, but a couple more things. One, just any other advice that you would want to give to someone who wants to get into journalism, who wants to, cover sports journalism, kind of give you an open platform here. Anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked you that's kind of part of your story that you think is part of this conversation that we've had today?
No, I mean, as far as aspiring young journalists, I just, you just got to get all the experience you can. The thing is, like, if you're a go-getter, you can go and get even more than you could back when we were getting into the business. When I was trying to get in, it was just like applying to jobs everywhere. Now you can start your own YouTube channel. You can start this, you can start that. Just make sure you're doing it right. Like if you want to be taken seriously as a journalist, make sure you're doing it right. Young kids today need to understand there's a difference between being a journalist and just being a media personality. Just because you have a YouTube channel doesn't necessarily make you anything special, right? Like, just remember the responsibility that you have, though, if you build your platform, to truth, to accuracy, no fake news. Like, that's the hard part, I think, now for young aspiring journalists. It just seems like, a lot of kids want to get into, like we talked about earlier, you're a fan and you want to be around the sport. Just remember, you want to be a journalist, you're going to have to be able to check that at the door. That's the biggest thing that I could say. And I think it's harder now more than ever because it's real easy to just start up your own stuff.
If someone wants to write for you, what's your advice for them? Do you look for freelancers? If whenever you do have openings, how do you go about finding people? How should they know in case they want to work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open. I receive emails from a lot of people who want to get into the MMA media industry. That's tough because the MMA media industry in general, you can kind of tell from the inquiries if they are interested in being journalists and reporters, or if they're interested in being, just getting in because they want to have the access and be around fights. In our industry, video skills are a big deal. Video skills are huge. If you have good video skills, you can shoot your own video, you can produce your own video, you can interview well. That'll always get you a leg up. For me, and what I'm looking for, that'll always get you a leg up in terms of competition and stacking you up against other people. That's a big one.
All right. The final thing we like to do on the Where You At podcast is we like to brag about other San Diego State alums, whether it's people we know, people we don't know, and what they are doing with their life, with their careers. You've already given a bunch of shout outs, but if there's anyone else that you want to focus on, spotlight, the floor is yours once again, Simon.
Well, I'm going to shout out Dan Hayes, man. That's our guy. Dan has been a great friend for many years now. Dan Hayes and I first came across, we just missed each other at the Daily Aztec. We just missed each other, but he was working at the North County Times when I started working at the North County Times. And I spent a good couple of years working with him. He had already been pretty well established there as a community guy. But the great thing was when Dan got his opportunity to cover the Padres, when the Padres job opened up, and he got that opportunity, he ran with it. And I'm proud of him because look at him now. Like, he's been covering baseball for how many years now? 15 years? How long has it been? 15 years?
At least 15, maybe even close to 20 now.
And he's been killing it. Probably 20 years almost. And he's been killing it, man. He's been killing it. He does excellent work at The Athletic, covering the Twins. I'm really proud of him. I definitely learned a lot from him. And he's just been a really great friend over the years. We enjoyed going to Niner games together. So that's always been fun. We've had good times, but yeah, I got to give a shout out to Dan though.
I'm going to give a shout out to someone who I haven't met, but someone who I know of. His name is Morgan Prickett, and he recently graduated from San Diego State. He got a job as a production assistant at NBC Sports. And a couple of days ago, I saw him post something about just how grateful he was for the opportunity to contribute to a couple of big NBC events this summer. He worked on the Tour de France in late June and also the lead up to the 2024 Paris Olympics. Again, his name is Morgan Prickett. He's another Daily Aztec alum. He covered the Final Four a couple of years ago, and his career is off to a fabulous start. So congratulations. Shout out to Morgan.
Shout out to Morgan. It's always great. Isn't it cool when you just find out that when you find out someone who caught a break or has taken great steps in their career, and you're like, oh, they're a San Diego State alum. I always feel great pride when I find that out. Like, that's awesome. That's always great because we come from the same beginnings.
Yep, absolutely. And that's what I love about this podcast is being able to spotlight people and hear their stories about how it began and the process that led to them to what they are, and then hearing the story behind the story on these really proud moments as a journalist. So Simon, man, this was so much fun. I learned a lot, and I know that everyone who listens to this is going to come away with a better understanding of what it means to be a journalist and what it means to cover an individual sport like mixed martial arts. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Once again, my name is Josh Suchon. I'm the host of the Where You At podcast. That was Simon Samano. He is the managing editor of MMAJunkie.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week on the Where You At podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Where You At podcast. This is Devin Watley from the class of 2021. Thanks to Martine Marine for creating the music you're hearing right now, and Alex Piscatelli for her work on the podcast name and artwork on social media. And a reminder to SDSU alums, we really want to know where you're at. Tell us about your career. Get involved in the school. There's many ways you can do this, from donating your time or money, mentoring students, to even speaking in classrooms, in person or on Zoom. Your work can help us grow the program and create more opportunities for our students to succeed. Again, thanks for listening. Subscribe to this podcast. Tell your friends. Recommend us a future guest. And go Aztecs.